So I'm glad, when you were talking about this Tamil politics and, giving us the social and economic history of Tamil Nadu, you mentioned, agrarian crisis, you mentioned land, you mentioned sort of the move to the city. Some authors, and so we have in India seen this sort of rise of capitalism, right? And some authors have suggested that capitalism will erode repressive traditions and institutions. In India, of course, there's significant capitalist penetration, and yet caste-related violence appears to be on the rise, whether it's in the form of floggings or lynchings or intimidation of peaceful protests, etc. So could you comment on that, this sort of, is that consistent? Is that not consistent? How do you see these two trends that, so to speak, in India at the moment?
Well, this thing that capitalism would shatter pre-capitalist social relations and so on, which is, I think, derived from a very simple reading of the manifesto, basically.
Right.
That, I think, has not happened anywhere in India. Look at the long history of capitalist development. And in fact, if you look at particular histories, for instance, the history of the Bombay working class, Chandawaka's work and the work of Newman and people like that, it's pretty evident that the working class itself was constituted out of caste identities, in the sense that particular caste groups found themselves concentrated in particular industries. And Chandawaka talks about who was doing what in Bombay. So, in a sense, the identities that you had in the village economy also provided you with a kind of social capital which enabled you move in a certain direction. I don't think capitalism tried to sort of level that and create an open playing field or anything like that. Capitalism anyway is not interested in an open playing field, so to speak. So even if you look at the making of the working class, you see that at the level of the worker even, it has not been possible to separate class from where the worker eventually found herself or himself. Even in Tamil Nadu, for example, if you read Sharat Chari's Fraternal Capital, where he looks at the making of the hosiery industry in Coimbatore, you will see how caste has played a very important role in accumulation itself, in the form of, again, it's very interesting, dowries, for example, have contributed a great deal to capital accumulation for the setting up of small businesses, and how communities which have access to capital, either because they have landed resources or because they are part of a community that will trust you because you're also one of them and give you a loan and an advance and so on, whereas communities that don't have that are sort of resigned to continuing in trades where they find themselves from the beginning, like say Dalits who are concentrated in the dyeing industry, in the cotton trade, like the cotton complex in Coimbatore. Dalits don't have social capital. So I think therefore capitalism as shattering pre-capitalist relations has not really taken place in any significant way in the Indian context. And this argument has been made for gender also, no? I mean that patriarchal relations were reworked into capitalist forms of production and so on. So the same argument can be made about caste also, I think. I think there was this brief moment when in the early 2000s, there were people who issued that Bhopal Declaration, which claimed that in this neoliberal era, Dalits also should take advantage of emergent markets and so on, forgetting that the markets were already structured in a way that blocked access and allowed access in certain very sort of specific ways. So I don't know what that means, that you can actually be from a subordinate caste and be part of this neoliberal economy in any meaningful way for yourself to advance your own interests. And even when capitalists want to sort of work at say something like affirmative action, and I know the Tatas do this because my sister works for the Tatas, and I'm very curious as to how they work affirmative action. With women it's simpler. With caste, for example, if say Titan, the watch company, you have these leather straps, so obviously you have to have a supply chain that goes back to the leather industry. The Tata's way of working their affirmation action policies is to make sure that all the vendors are Dalits. Now, how do you see that? It's affirming them in their caste trade. Of course, it's going to be financially productive, and it will make Dalit lives a little better in terms of material comfort and access to a skill and perhaps to higher education. And it will, of course, keep them liquid in an economy which is always sort of bound to debt and debt bondage and so on. But it's also interesting how caste becomes the basis for mobilizing a certain kind of supply chain network which is supposed to be liberating.
Right.
So I don't know if you can, as Ambedkar says, you turn around the corner, caste is a monster, you'll have to cross at every point. So I don't know about capitalism actually recasting social relations of caste and so on. I like Balagopal's very homely definition of caste as a production relationship, that you are born with certain kinds of skills and certain tools of your trade. You inherit them. Anything else you have to struggle and fight for. So in that sense, if caste is seen as a production relationship, the current capitalist forms of growth sit very well with the caste system. I mean, I think the Banias of India continue to be the great industrialists of India also. There are exceptions, no doubt. And the middle managerial level is completely composed of Babus and Tambrams and whoever else that sort of play this role of, what in the British period the Dubashas did, the bilingual Dubashas who communicated at both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
So I think that is also still intact. So I'm not sure what capitalism has actually done by way for caste as such, except that I think, and here I'd like to go back to Ambedkar, I think one of the interesting arguments he makes when he asks for a repeal of the Mahar Vatan, these pieces of land that are given to Mahar heads of communities in return for non-specific services to the village.
Right.
And what it means is it's basically what in Andhra is called vetti. It's basically non-accounted for labor. You could be called upon to do anything.
Yes.
And your only gain is that you inherit this piece of land and you pass it down the line. So Ambedkar wanted it replaced by wage labor. So in a classic Marxist sense, wage labor is seen as an advance over pre-modern non-contractual relations, because wage labor will free you from the social bondage of caste.
Right.
Now, I think in the Indian context, you both exist simultaneously.
Yes.
So it's hard to sort of see one replacing the other. You may not have the classic forms of vetti, but economic dependence continues in other ways and so on. So I think one will have to also rethink this whole notion of even that primary moment in transformation of peasant worker into an industrial worker through the agency of wage labor has not fully happened in the Indian context.
Right.
Not even an industrial worker, into an agrarian worker
Right.
has not fully happened in the Indian context. And wherever it has happened has when Dalits desert the agrarian economy for an industrial or a factory-based or a city-based economy, you find that they are sort of employed in the lowest rungs of that economy.
Sure.
Very seldom do they get, unless they fight, struggle, they've already achieved a level of growth in education. That has not happened. So I think, therefore, the relationship between caste and capitalism is pretty tight, I would say, in some ways.
So it's
That's at one level. But at another level, I think what's happening today, more specifically what's been happening over the last, say, decade, let's put it. Because I also don't want to lay every sin at Hindutva's door, because the capitalist sin is far older.
Absolutely.
And I think what is also happening is the emergence of a class of middle class youth, young people, who are extremely entitled, having inherited the promises of the Nehruvian state in a good productive way, like they've had access to this country's premier educational institutions through no effort of their own. The IITs, for example, or the IIMs, who've come into higher education, who are part of this burgeoning service industry in different ways, whether it's the IT sector or the media or whatever it is. Now, they have a sense of entitlement which makes them think that they have arrived, and therefore the logic which has propelled them into place is the only possible logic, and that everyone should either arrive like they have, or if they haven't, it's their fault.
Right.
Right?
So this is the individualist logic, right?
Logic.
Pull yourself
Pull
up by the
yourself up.
bootstraps.
Only in India, you haven't done it because you're not as good as I am.
Right.
And what does that mean? That then morphs into a caste logic, into all these spurious arguments about merit, that you can't make it, that you've come here because of the reservation policy. If you look at that Youth for Avaz or Swarajya, all these magazines which are sort of purportedly reasonable about many of these issues, but which are really sort of soft Hindutva spaces, you'll see these kinds of arguments being made. So you have an entitled section of largely Brahmins, upper caste, and some dominant caste groups, and for the first time, I think, they have decided that they don't have to entertain shame about either being from this or that caste, or about telling the poor, get on with it.
Right.
I think there was some inhibition in the past. You didn't say it even if you wish to say it. You didn't think that the poor ought to pull their socks and get on with their lives. You
Right.
felt still somewhere, oh, maybe I'm responsible too, or the Indian state is responsible, or somebody ought to be responsible. But today it's like, too bad. If you don't do it, that's your fault.
Right.
And to hell with you.
Right.
So there's a certain resolute absence of shame,
Right.
or the feeling of responsibility, and that is not replaced by anything else positive towards. It's not even like, it's not even that liberal thing of educating the working classes that you find in Victorian England, right?
Right.
Night schools for the mechanics,
Right.
draw them into the industrial economy, do
Right.
some. It's not even that. It's
No.
like, leave them to die. Who cares?
Yeah.
So there is that aspect also that's emerged, I think, and I think that's at one level, which is why I think there's a kind of tacit tolerance for the kinds of crimes that you see. Those crimes themselves are emerging out of a different logic, though, I think. One certainly is the impossibility of coming to terms with Dalit assertion. There is very little in our social and cultural milieu to help us deal with that in a civilized, decent way, I think. And this is something that we need to also think about carefully, because one of the things that we are all used to when we talk of Dalit assertion is to sort of imagine that just a question of rights, it's a question of equality, of laying claims on state resources. But there's also a phenomenological basis to it. It's an assertion also of a despised self, no? And
Of a dignity,
of dignity
right.
of being, and the rest of society is so used to thinking of them as non-being. So I think they have no way of decoding what's happening there, and I think every assertion by Dalits fills them with rage or with bewilderment or with confusion, because they think somehow that has something to do with them.
Right.
And here is where I think Ambedkar's idea of graded inequality becomes a very useful analytical statement, because your sense of self is closely tied to who you can kick. So that person is going to kick you back, or will say, fuck you and I'm going to do other stuff.
Right.
Then you feel extremely sort of unstable too.
Right.
So some of it is coming from that.
Right.
A lot of it is also coming from the fact that, as a correlate of this shameless, entitled bourgeois culture that's emerged in parts of India, you have a state that is perfectly willing to countenance acts of violence against Dalits or Muslims. In fact, at one level, not even wanting to acknowledge that such things are taking place.
Right.
So I think multiple levels this is happening, and so and I think the BJP strategy, it appears, at least for those of us who look to the horrors of the last two massive spurts of violence in Gujarat and in Odisha,
Right.
it's very evident that sort of spectacular killing is not going to be what they want to do. They don't want to do this spectacle of death stuff anymore. It appears they want the slow grade, continuous violence.
which
It's a kind of buzz in the background. It makes you very uneasy. It's very menacing. You can never fully be at peace, because I think in this age of social media, you can't get away with violent crimes without somebody actually recording something.
Right.
Whereas this sort of low grade stuff, it's like low intensity conflict. It's exactly that.
That is
And that shamelessness with regard to the Dalit question,
right.
and anyway they had no shame with regard to the Muslim question,
Right.
is also a reflection of the constituencies that support them, and that
Right.
they are complicit with those constituencies, and they pay the barest lip service to all of this. I mean, even their appropriation of Ambedkar is not serious, no?
Right.
I mean, they have tried, but it's like so bad, so banal that anyone can sort of see through it. So it's like they don't even want to try bringing Dalits into their fold, though for opportunistic reasons they would. And if you have Atwale or Ramvilas Paswan or Udit Raj or various others being part of their combine, or you have the president himself being a Dalit, it's as much a desperation on the part of Dalit groups to find a political birth for themselves as it is of Hindutva to draw them in. I mean, what's happening in UP is that they have the cynical manipulation of different Dalit interests to the advantage of the ruling party. That's what you find. So given this situation, their absolute disregard, contempt for Dalits such crimes against Dalits of the kind we've been seeing are to be expected. But in other parts of the country, there are other logics I feel at work. I think Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, we really have to look at what has happened to the legacy of Ambedkarism, non-Brahminism in our states. I mean, I've sort of tried to suggest how we might look at Tamil Nadu, but Maharashtra is also very interesting. Because I think this whole Maratha assertion that you see, which is sort of perhaps comparable to the Patel assertion in Gujarat, none of these communities are lacking in resources.
Absolutely.
But where is the anger coming from? I mean, the Vanyas are still, a large section of them is poor.
Right.
The colors are not super rich, or neither are they all super powerful.
Right.
But the Marathas, a substantial section is sort of, arrived, so to speak, and even if not materially powerful in all cases, socially it's certainly not stigmatized.
Absolutely.
And so where is that coming from?
Right.
And I think there's a great unease with the kind of Ambedkarite legacy that's become part of some very strange Congress politics, which the Congress has also dropped now and then, and the kind of barb they get by BJP being actually in power,
Right.
and seeing how they can work that to their advantage. So, but I don't know nearly enough about Maharashtra to see how to understand that. But I also, now that I'm really looking at a lot of Ambedkar's writings and also trying to get a sense of what else was happening in Maharashtra during that period, there's always, Ambedkar's always been perpetually both supportive of Shudra claims and suspicious of Shudra practice.
Right.
While he grants them their democratic rights of access to public resources and so on, he's not sanguine about their interest in democracy.
Right.
So I think there is that we need to keep in mind. And
it's a skepticism that is
That's
very
true.
healthy.
It's a very
and
healthy skepticism, which is very interesting because he endorses their democratic rights while being suspicious of their non-democratic practice. So that's something which is the same case in his attitude with the Muslim League also.
Right.
As a minority religion, yes, I endorse your rights. But as for your practice in terms of how you think of caste and much else, I have my doubts.
Right.
So I think with the Maratha thing also you find that the kind of anxiety that these communities appear to be propelled by has to be understood.
Right.
And I'm not sure what the tools are available in Maharashtra. I'm sure there are people studying it.
Right.
But in Tamil Nadu, it's very clearly at one level having to do with the agrarian economy, with the land economy, and with the fact that peasant society sadly has been left to its own devices
Yes.
in a very cruel way.
Yes.
And in Maharashtra, there's been peasant assertion of a kind you don't see much in Tamil Nadu. You only have a kind of coming together to protest Kaveri, but
Right.
very little else.
Yes.
So recently, of course, they've been in the news much more because of being in Jantar Mantar
Right.
and so on. But even those are well-heeled presence. Some of them, you don't see the man with 2 acres or 3 acres who constitutes a majority of peasants. Who, I mean, when the rains failed in 2016-17, and for the first time, you had a significant number of suicides in Tamil Nadu. We were aghast at all that we uncovered about peasant life. I mean, we knew aspects of it, debts, indebtedness, then the desperation that comes because you have these 3 acres and anything you invest by way of technology never ever pays off.
Right.
You're not liquid, your children don't want to be part of the economy. You have to take loans for every occasion that is not planned for.
Right.
And that's women who bear the brunt of that whole debt situation because friends of ours who went and did some surveys actually saw women running to hide from microcredit debt collectors. It was painful. So you have something that's terribly wrong with peasant life, and you can see that manifesting itself in a kind of generalized angst, anger, petty violence against Dalits or atrocious violence against Dalits. Whereas in Maharashtra, I think one will have to also think of what's happening and why that Maratha assertion is also sending out menacing messages to Dalits and how Dalits read it.
Right.
So during this whole Bhima Koregaon thing, there was this thing of let's not see Marathas and Dalits as bitterly opposed to each
Right.
other and so on, because they were united in their fight against the Peshwai in the
Right.
past.
Yes.
But again, as I said, we can all recall bits of history we like, but what does that mean in the present is a
Right.
moot question. So there is
And
that.
at what points do you want to recollect
Exactly,
history,
exactly.
right?
So
So based on what you've said, like there are actually 3 questions that rise, and one has to do with this, you were talking about low grade violence. One has to do with you're pointing out how Western, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu are different from UP, and then one has to do with why peasants in Tamil Nadu have not sort of asserted themselves the way they might have in Maharashtra. So let me start with that first one, which is that it's this low-grade violence, right? Sort of in your writings, you say something very similar where you talk about, the caste-based violence, right? Which sort of is, in a sense, exceptional, right? So you have or violence, right? In this kind of spectacular violence.
Kerala type of
Right, Kerala type of situation. Or if you talk about religious minorities, you can talk about Gujarat, Muzaffarnagar, etc. But then you have this low-grade violence, or what you talk about as the ordinariness of caste, right? Which is the normalization of caste in everyday life. But you're also adding to this the normalization of violence associated with caste in everyday life, right? So, I mean, does this normalization, not just of violence, but the everyday practices, right? Where we don't recognize how caste is imbibed in our everyday lives. Does that impede sort of the left's mobility to organize and mobilize? And in a sense, do you see that pushing the working classes and the peasants towards a caste-based assertion as opposed to a class-based assertion? And I'm using class sort of as a catch-all phrase. I'm talking more of a mobilization that has to do with emancipation rather than sort of the narrow way in which one might use class.
Right. Well, that's an important question. I don't know if I have very clear thoughts on the subject, but I'll tell you what I may have thought about.
Yeah.
One is that to take the whole peasant crisis in Tamil Nadu, for example, I will restrict myself to Tamil Nadu. Sure. I don't know enough about other states. For example, if you take the instance of violence against Dalits that was spectacular in the last few years, one is, of course, the Dharmapuri violence,
right.
The Ilavaras Divya love story, which became the cause for torching an entire Dalit neighborhood. Then the kind of violence that has sort of been in attendance on a number of intercaste marriages.
Right.
Both these things you've seen. Apart from that spectacular thing, just the continuing violence against couples that marry outside their caste. Now, how does one understand this is a question. One is, of course, I think we really don't have a culture of, for want of a better word, romantic sociability. No, we don't. We are not allowed to be romantic in public. We not even hold hands.
Or sometimes even in private, right?
In private,
if you're
in a family,
in extended family.
So there is that. Yes. But I think the world, the public spaces that have emerged over the last few decades, just because more and more young people are out there doing stuff from the middle classes, but also from the working classes, because I think more and more women are going out to work, and anyone who's finished +2 does find work in a factory or in a company or in a store, and would rather do that than sort of sit at home or do domestic labor. And nobody wants to do domestic labor or be part of unequal social situations in their place of origin.
Right.
Anyone who has a chance to get out and do stuff will, and they do so.
Yeah.
Definitely women want to do that.
Yes,
desirous. So lots of women are there out there, and there are also more and more women accessing higher education from all the non-Brahmin communities.
Right.
Whether they do something with their education to further their livelihood and other interests is a different story, and I'm afraid your own work and Mary John's work shows that you have a rolling back of women's labor rather than an expansion of it. But I think whatever it is that they are visible in these spaces, workspaces, educational spaces, public spaces, brings them into contact with undifferentiated others, men, people of the third gender, whoever, depending on your inclination, right? So I think there's nothing in our culture to prepare us for that interaction. There's nothing. I mean, we don't have a culture of romantic sociability. When you have to communicate across community lines, you have no sense of how to do it. It's furtive. You're scared. I mean, none of this really. There's nothing. You can't rehearse for such things. I say this because I'm on the sexual harassment committee of some educational institutions, and much of the tension that I see in these institutions among students, I don't mean faculty and students. That's a different story. Is largely social tensions, which are class caste tensions. Mm-hmm. So you will have, say, someone who's come from a small town or the Mofussil, made it to MSc. Right. Then you will have someone from Delhi or Bombay who's a BTech student. And if one is male and one is female and something happens, right, it's immediately put down to the man being aggressive or the girl being arrogant. But you decode it a bit gently and in a more kind of slow way, you see that it's also a complete miscommunication because they don't speak each other's social language. So there is that happening widely. So I think those kinds of changes, there's nothing in our cultural milieu to help us process that or understand that. And that, when it sort of unfolds the background of an agrarian economy in crisis, I think young men from these peasant communities who see their resources dwindling, who don't see a future in agriculture, who partially come to the city to work but also find it hard to leave behind their village or semi-rural homes, they cannot countenance the kind of liaisons that appear all around them. They don't know what to do. Some of them are maybe even part of those liaisons, but they don't know what to do with it. And when something happens that is part of their kin network or their caste network, they obviously react with the utmost aggression and violence. That's at a very emotional, social kinship level. But also I think it becomes an occasion for these communities to teach Dalits their place, because they see Dalits as somehow having managed better than them. And they don't put it down to Dalit effort or Dalit investment in education, but to reservation.
Right. Or sort of
preferential,
right,
whatever,
like
by
handouts
the state.
From the state.
Handouts from the state. I mean, the poignant story of Dharmapuri is every one of those houses was built out of labor in Bangalore.
Right.
So no one wants to sort of think about that as having created Dalit wealth. Or the fact that because of Ambedkar, there is a long history of Dalit investment in education, which is not what you see with peasant communities. There is no ideological impetus to push all limits and go and study. Unless you've decided you want to become a doctor, engineer, then you force your papa to mortgage his land, or father himself feels like mortgaging his land, or whatever. But the run-of-the-mill small peasant is not nowhere close to doing that. Besides, his land will not fetch any mortgage also. There's that.
Yeah.
So I think those are the sections that really get very angered, and they may be pushed by dominant class sections within their communities, or political players in their communities. But basically, the for want of a better word, the romantic crisis and the agrarian crisis come together. The romantic crisis is a happy one in my opinion, but it's not allowed to be happy.
Right.
But this one is sort of a sad development, and there's nothing to help anyone make sense of this. Dalits have the least interest in trying to understand upper caste violence. Why should they? But the upper caste should understand why they are getting to be violent,
right,
or others who are interested in mobilizing them. Now, how does one mobilize on issues of agrarian crisis or romantic crisis for that matter? So, peasant organizations in Tamil Nadu largely been of the left kind. Most of them have been under the auspices of the CPI or the CPM.
Right.
So, they typically have their Kisan Sabhas and their agricultural workers organizations. That itself is a huge sort of contradiction, because that's also a caste contradiction in many ways, with the laborers being largely Dalit and the Kisans being largely non-Dalit. Anyway, there's that. But the Kisan organizations at least sort of come together from time to time, but agricultural organizations are not able to sort of do much. Even in the Delta, when we were doing the survey of Delta distress, they joined us in sort of feeling angsty.
Right.
So that was what we found. So they've all not been able to really, over a period, consistently work on peasant issues.
Right.
I don't know what the CPM would have to say about my diagnosis, but they have peasant fronts, they do hold meetings, but what has really translated into practice beyond better remunerative prices or better or the writing off of loans, we don't know.
Right.
There's been no asking for the whole structure of agriculture to be rehauled, however idealistic that might sound. I mean, even Rajana Padi, who's worked on the Punjab agricultural situation, she said the farmer crisis. There's been some work with the agricultural unions there in posing some of these questions. But I think their dilemma is real. I mean, they are speaking from the present, where not having to pay a loan makes a huge difference. So not to articulate that is completely not a possible. This is a stupid thing. But to keep on doing that year after year also locks you in this agrarian economy, which really needs a fundamental rehauling of one kind or the other. So I don't think the left has got there into thinking through this rehauling. What does that mean? And in fact, the agrarian question, as discussed by the left, has spent a lot of time about trying to understand Asian mode of production. There's no need. I mean, how does that help? But actually looking at the details of what has been unfolding in our agrarian economies, apart from mapping out the consequences of the Green Revolution, which I think some exceptional work has been done, but But in terms of the present crisis, um, in a political economy sense, what can be said? I don't know. Maybe
Right.
there is some work, but I don't know enough.
So I think also I was hoping for you if you could comment on why recognition of caste is important, right?
Yes, I
which
think-
is what you
yes.
kind of alluded to.
Yes.
But like how important, and you've written about this, of course, it's like how caste is important in trying to understand like how this mobilization can occur, right?
Yes, exactly.
Especially in light of the fact that there are caste-based either political parties or groups that are also sort of competing, right? So you have this competition where you have on the one hand caste-based assertions, right, or mobilization, and on the other hand you have people trying to organize on economic or socio-economic concerns, right? But when you don't attend to the caste element of why an agrarian crisis and why different sections of society might be sort of affected differently, right? So
yes. Yeah, let me again go back to the 1 years, because I think that's a very useful example,
Right.
because they are a large peasant community, but also because I read very laterally. My information is drawn from conversations and fiction.
Right.
I don't read that much political economy. But say if you take the 1 years for example, there was a novel that was published 2 years ago from someone from within the community who's now a mechanic with the State Transport Corporation. So he's an excellent novelist. Anyway, so he has written about what happened to all those whose lands were taken away for the second phase of expansion of the Neyveli Lignite Corporation. Now, how has this issue been addressed in Tamil politics? At one level, it's been the left is very active when it comes to workers in NLC, whether they are contract workers or casual laborers or permanent workers, in trying to sort of mobilize them around their just demands, making permanent contract workers, blah blah blah, better term.
Yes.
Standard left
Yes.
union politics, that they are very good at, and they do that. But then, what about this whole question of appropriation of peasant land? How do you understand something like that? And I think the left still works with the notion of growth, which imagines that industrial expansion will somehow compensate for appropriation of land. That's at one level. The second, and that is problematic in many ways. So, for example, even in Tuticorin, I think it was important to call attention to the workers in the Sterlite factory and ask questions about what is their future. But how do you connect the dots then? That connection the left is not making anywhere. The larger crisis of which this is one expression, right? So that's a general epistemological issue for the left. But in a more caste-specific sense, so in this novel what you see is he maps this whole process of appropriation of land and the simultaneous rise of the Patali Makkal Katchi, the PMK, the Vaniyar Sangam and the PMK, and how they play a very enabling role in helping peasants think through this crisis and sort of engage with it. And amongst them, of course, emerge a class of brokers and fixers and all of that. But basically, the question is also, a party which is rooted in caste identities will address certain aspects of this crisis, but is not going to address the aspect of land being lost and them being proletarianized or just being thrown into this vast migratory group that leaves the villages and so on. The novelist, of course, is concerned about this huge nostalgia for the loss of land itself. So there is all of that. So they have a caste resolution, which is to build their party, to do brokering, and as a panacea, ask for more reservations. So this is their understanding. Then you have the Tamil nationalist groups, which will constantly badger the NLC for better returns to the Tamils, because it's a public sector unit run by the central government. So you have a Tamil nationalist attempt to understand. You have somebody from within the one-year community trying to understand. But where is the left voice in all of this? I mean, they should be attentive to all of this and then come with a socialist perspective which takes these things seriously, because people are moved by these things, and raise the argument to a level of sanity and complexity. No? But do we see that happening? So this is my problem. It's not so much that they are not sensitive to caste alone. They have a very truncated sense of growth, a very strange sense of growth and development. And they are resolutely refusing to join the dots, because it means you take each of them seriously. Not have this kind of very knee-jerk thing of assimilating everything to an already existent model of socialist growth. Rethink this whole thing, no?
Yes.
And so to take caste seriously is to take caste seriously as a mode of production also. As a factor in production itself. not simply in terms of atrocities and somebody being more casteist. Yes, somebody is more casteist than somebody else. But with the one-year peasants, the call of a caste party is bound to attract them if you don't recognize that they are losing out, and them being small caste peasants is what is part of the problem. But how do you convince them that their caste concerns can be addressed in certain ways, but they also have to organize as peasants? How do you do that?
Right.
Not by sort of the symbolic affirmation of caste. No.
Right.
You need, and not just by having Kisan Sabha and agricultural workers front.
Right.
I mean, I don't want to decry any of these efforts. I don't want,
Sure.
because I do find that it's very fashionable to decry the established left. I don't want to do that. I do think there are extremely able people working on the ground. People are doing excellent work, but somehow intellectually these things are not adding up to anything, I feel. So in my understanding, to understand caste would also mean that.
Right.
You can plug it in there. So that's at one level.
Okay.
And at another level, for example, where the left has been somewhat successful, at least in Tamil Nadu, perhaps in Haryana also, I'm told, is the CPM. I will come to the far left later.
Right.
But the CPM, for example, has set up this untouchability eradication front. It received a lot of flack for it. Why untouchability eradication? Why not caste annihilation? Be that as it may.
Yeah.
I think it has brought them face to face with the reality of the ordinariness of violence against Dalits,
Yes.
and which I speak of a lot, because I think when you speak to people in the movement, you realize how overstretched they are in terms of the work they have to do
Right.
in confronting the ordinariness of this violence,
Right.
because it is structured into the everyday. And atrocity is one thing. So, and the ordinariness of violence would require you to work round the clock every day, and not everything can be resolved through a civil rights register or through filing a case, but it would require active mobilization on the ground in some complex ways. It's not that the left is not familiar with that. I mean, there's a very good historian called Raghupati who teaches in a local college in Dindivanam,
Right.
and he's written about this, and he writes very well, and he is with the broad left basically, and he has this great essay on a village, on a village, small whatever, in which for a long time has been a left bastion,
Right.
CPI,
Right.
and constantly the vice president of the panchayat would be a Dalit. So he says there was a time when it was possible for the left to organize intercaste dinners, to insist on open sociability in common spaces. Then later on, the same space became captive to casteist groups. Now, why did that happen? And Dalits felt completely miffed by all this. And Dalits, in fact, are now wanting to organize as peasants, because in this overall transformation of that economy, the dominant castes are into brokerage and illegal forms of extraction, whereas they are left with land,
Right.
which they want to farm.
Yes.
So it's a very strange situation.
Yes.
But the left party, the CPI there is not equal to the occasion, because along the way, somewhere that energy into fighting caste and class became routinized.
Right.
So they have not queried certain developments that have taken place subsequently. They have not asked themselves what are they doing in temple festivals where honors are apportioned on a caste basis. How should they approach such issues? They have
Right.
not developed ways of talking.
Right.
They have not asked questions about why all Sarkari institutions have to be in the Uru and not in the Cheri.
Right.
So some of these issues have to be rethought as well. So it's also that you can look at your own history and draw lessons. It's not that it has to be Lal Salam, Neel Salam.
Right.
No? Because even in East Tanjavur, and I often fight with my left comrades on this, your own history shows you've been most successful when you've addressed caste and class in tandem.
Right.
Your strongest unions are leather workers unions, BD rollers unions, agricultural workers unions.
Yeah.
So where is that history? I mean, that history doesn't have a conceptual correlate. It doesn't have a philosophical correlate.
Right.
But the practice was there. The fantastic comrades on the ground, self-effacing, whose entire life was devoted to such work. So
Right.
there is that, I think, as part
Right.
of where the left is sort of really got to rethink some of these issues.
Yeah.
And I find this untouchability eradication front is forced to confront that in some ways. And that's an interesting thing. And how much they will be able to do what they do is one thing. But I think they've also realized, to use a different phrase, the relative autonomy of the caste question. I think that's an important realization.
Right. I think also, something that you have again written is, how caste itself doesn't or a caste identity, or sort of subscribing to a caste identity doesn't foreclose the possibility of other identity markers, right?
Yes.
And so how does, and so that's sort of what you're also
Yes.
talking about.
Yeah.
I think also the other thing that, was getting from, what you were saying and have been saying for some time is also sort of the specificity of of the regional, right? So
Yes,
when you
yes.
talk about putting together or piecing together the histories of various regions and looking at even the sort of the accumulation of capital
Yes,
that
yes.
occurs within these caste groups, the fine graded nature
Yes.
of caste, right? And how important it is that we understand these specificities,
yeah.
right? And I feel like that's sort of what
Yes,
I'm
and I think one
hearing.
can expand that even further. There's also this tendency to think of caste with a big C. Like there is an all India way of talking about it. There is none, frankly. Which is why it makes sense to talk of caste in terms of geography.
Right.
Because caste is also, as an institution, has evolved in response to particular ecological niches.
Right.
And that's very, very important.
Right.
Even in the Tamil case, for example, extreme forms of caste servitude along with class servitude have existed in the wet river valleys rather than in the dry zones, because you don't need to control labor with such a tight hand where there is no widespread agriculture, for instance.
Right.
What would you do?
Yeah.
Oh, you will control them for other reasons,
Right.
perhaps, but
Or
you don't
through
need,
other means.
through other means, or
Right.
you don't need bonded labor in the
Right.
dry zones. So I
Right.
think geography has a very important role to play in helping us understand the relationship between caste and the environment, and the kinds of production issues as well as the kind of labor relations that emerge from such a milieu. And I think that's something that awaits to be done, and that's very, very important. So, for example, in the Tamil context today, when you look at an extractive economics, what is the extractive? You don't have anything like Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand. You don't have these huge
Right.
resources that a Jindal or an SR is going to come and throw people off, and
Right.
that's not what Tamil Nadu is all about. Now, where that extractive economy has been at work is largely on the coast. It's again, geography,
Right.
you have to look for it,
Right.
not in forests alone. Forest is one sort of a commons, but the coast is equally, and anyone who's lived in a coastal city knows
Right.
that. And here, the coast, for example, one main form of extraction has been sand. Both river sand and coastal sand. Coastal sand for garnets and all these rare minerals which are used into making stuff for these upper class homes, whatever they make.
Yeah.
So basically, I think that extractive economy has to do with a particular geography, and who does it affect? People whose livelihoods are linked with that environment, largely fishers.
Right.
So how do you understand this aspect of caste production environment? You need this mediating term of geography, right? Or likewise, if you look at something like the granite industry, and that's another horrible form of extraction, employing the worst coercive forms of labor, control, regulation, terrible working conditions, all of that stuff. Again, that happens in a dry land. Where do you find granite? Those stones are found in semi-plateau, semi-whatever
Right.
regions. So somewhere the environment plays such a role in enabling certain kinds of extractive activities and certain kinds of social relations. And one will have to take that on board, and the kinds of social relations that have existed there or continue to exist.
Right.
And social relations are mostly caste relations.
Right.
To understand how do you then engage with that.
Right.
So it's not simply that my coastal sand is going, but it's also that you're destroying the fisher economy.
Right.
Completely, which is already in crisis for 100 different reasons. So I think those aspects have to be thought through. So when we say do caste, we mean all of this. We just
Right.
don't mean that think of atrocities or think of violence and
Right.
When caste is a feature of political economy that has to be taken seriously.
And the spatial economy as well.
And the spatial economy
Right.
as well. Yeah.
So, and sort of along the lines of this location and geography, right? I mean, one of the, you worked significantly in the women's movement
Yes.
in India, and you worked significantly with marginalized spaces too, not just where there are, like workplaces or universities where they have sexual harassment committees, but also in places where they don't. And you've talked about how in those places, right, gendered violence can actually valorize the perpetrator of violence in some cases, right? So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah.
And the interplay of location, geography,
Yes.
the interplay of other factors
Yeah.
that might play a role, that we don't sort of urban India doesn't often think about it, right? And
Yes.
we were talking about the Me Too movement.
Yes.
So the Me Too movement sort of plays out differently, or that conversation could play out differently
Yes.
based on geography
Yes,
and
yes,
location.
Yes. See, one of the things that I found, much to my chagrin, when I was researching the Undoing Impunity
Yes.
book, is how women engage with what is commonly understood as sexual harassment or sexual control. So, of course, it's undeniably abusive and an exercise of power and authority. But where your sense of self does not have where you don't have this elusive sense of being free, which you can entertain in an urban middle class context, that you're free. No one feels free in any case, whether they work in a granite company or in a textile factory, or whether they're working on the field. No one feels free because you're not free. So the kind of sexual violation that emerges from that context is seen almost as a structural condition. And once you understand that, you shrug your shoulders and you deal with it. And I might remember how Charu Majumdar and others get very incensed about sexual violence. Whereas for a lot of women from the Orana Munda communities, it's like, it happens. I mean, that's what it is.
That's life.
That's life.
That's normal.
That's normal. That's not to downplay it, but to sort of think of how this violence is very much an aspect of the entire mechanics of control and authority exerted by caste class groups on other caste class groups. So once you get a sense of that structural nature of that violence, then you also understand why, say, for example, the Naxalite movement in Bihar set great store in the late 60s and 70s by actually fighting against the sexual control of peasant and agricultural workers by the Jat upper caste, where it was so important for them to sort of get that sense of, we can fight that and we don't mind annihilating a class enemy on that basis. Of course, notions of honor would play into it at some point, but it's also an existential situation where you feel finally that you can breathe, because that's not going to happen to you again. So I think that sense is something that you are not prepared for as a middle class urban researcher. And I have this old friend who used to be very active in CPM liberation in the past. She actually proudly says, I continue to do only a Narega work to this day. So she often tells me that you take it for granted and you see how you can work with it. So, and women have even been known to take turns and go into whoever has been called. So you sort of dissipate the kind of abuse that can take place over a number of bodies rather than on one body. I mean, it's horrible and terrible to be thinking of it in those terms, but basically that's a given situation for a number of women, and they fight, they negotiate, they do whatever they think they can do. And movements which have understood the specificity of that problem and its structural nature have actually something to teach us, I think. If you can you can peel off the honor discourse from that and look at the importance of what was attempted in those contexts. I think we have something to learn there. It's very, very important. And this also accounts for what you read about the popularity of the far left in Chhattisgarh. The kind of space that women have been able to carve for themselves within those formations, not only because they are these heroic fighting tribal women, but also that it has provided a space for negotiating some of these everyday givens, whether at the community level or at the level of the state or the village and so on. So I think those are important issues to keep in mind. Now, the kind of violence that you see in these spaces, in these marginal spaces, as you said, but which are really actually the predominant spaces in our society, I think it is so normalized as what men do or what men in a particular social context do. And there's a lot of bragging and there's a lot of sharing of experiences which emerge from that whole culture of braggart violence against women. And so sadly what happens when there's an inversion of that logic, like when you see when subaltern communities fight back, the language of gender control remains in place. And that's very unfortunate also. And we are very familiar with this from literature that speaks of it in different cultural and social
different regions
of India and in different parts of the world. There's all of that. But I think somewhere perhaps what we might want to think of is what we find in, say, in the African American context. For example, that very iconic book that emerged in when was that? 80s or 90s, Black Macho. Or the kind of work that African American feminists have been doing in terms of trying to understand black male rage and so on. Those kinds of things also need to be thought through carefully, I think. And I don't know what feminist context would make for that thinking through. right now in Dalit feminist circles, there's a lot of anger against what they call Savarna feminists,
Right.
and their insistence on taking an undifferentiated gender lens to
Right.
everything. While I grant the validity of that criticism, I also think that how else might one talk about subaltern rage, which sometimes expends itself on against women,
The
not
bodies of
bodies of women within the Dalit community.
Right.
It's and maybe against other women also in some cases. So, how does one talk about it? What's the political register that would be useful and enabling, and all of that? I think we need to also think through carefully.
Right.
And we haven't done nearly enough of those things, I feel.
Right.
We need to really ask some tough questions.
Right, so this is the gendering of caste and the casting of gender, and then of course also taking into account class, because that also
that's very,
plays
very important.
right?
Very,
And people have talked about even within the
Yes,
agrarian economy
Yes.
how women of different classes can and different castes exploit each other.
Exploit
right?
each other and control each other and all
Control
of
each
that.
other, right.
And so I think that's there are many conversations that are waiting to be had.
Yeah.
How may we do that is a very big question. I think one lesson one can learn, this is a very tangential illustrative example, but I think it is useful, is what's happening amongst Muslim women in India, which I find is a subject that is seldom taken on board when we talk of gender, because somehow it's seen as if that the only gender concerns there have to do with the uniform civil code.
Right.
But that's not true at all, as we all know. So I think what has been happening, and because I've been closely following some of those issues, because I used to work closely with what was called the Tamil Nadu Muslim Women's Jamaat,
Right.
which emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s. There's a very sort of vigorous churning in the Muslim communities across the country. And there's a lot of internal differentiation that has happened, both in terms of caste and gender. So you have this whole discourse around Pasmanda Muslims which has emerged in parts of northern India. And you also have a way in which Muslims from, say, Kerala, Tamil Nadu are also rethinking the terms of their alignment to Islam and connecting to local histories and local assertions, maybe wanting to be part of Dalit groups or Tamil nationalist groups or whatever the case may be. So I think that churning is a very interesting development and something we stand to learn from.
Right.
In terms of gender also there's been a churning. So for instance in Tamil Nadu, when there was some strange coming together of different people on this whole triple talaq business,
Right.
the range of people were there, feminists, Jamaat-e-Islami people, Muslim cultural organization, women with the hijab, women without the hijab, all kinds of a huge group. But what was very interesting was that while there were a number of opinions on whether this bill should be supported or not, one thing was very clear: a lot of women from within the Muslim community wanted forms of accountability that Muslim men can be held to. It may be the law, it may not be the law,
Right.
but you cannot deny the fact that this is an issue.
Right.
So I think there's a way in which they have come to pose issues within the community, while all the time being aware that puts the community in the spotlight in a vulnerable sort of way for Hindutva forces or whoever to sort of then do whatever they do. And Zakia with Bharatiya Muslim Mahila I think has been very aware of that.
Yeah.
But she's also decided that she's not going to wait for the moment of Hindutva to pass before she can get this
Right.
draft law into an act.
Right.
And that's a decision you can contest and argue with. But I think she also wants us to notice where that's coming from. The long history of struggle within communities, what women have endured, what women want, what they've been saying. So you choose to come into that debate at the moment when Hindutva forces use it, but they are one player in a very long history of many
and
players,
struggle
and all
right.
of that. And feminists have been saying that we know that story, but we are still entreating you to look at this differently. But Zakia says, who are you to tell me?
Right.
Because you have not, you supported these struggles, maybe you know of them, but to live through those struggles is something else.
Right.
And triple talaq is a major issue.
Right.
We have to talk about it.
Right.
So I think that is a model for learning from also on how to pose issues of violence within and between communities.
Right.
And how not to hierarchize or to sort of draw polarities between what is a legitimate feminist question to do with violence and what's not a legitimate question. But rather, what are the ways of talking about this violence and where do we learn our lessons from? So, I personally found that a very useful thing, listening to Zakia's reasoning.
Yeah. Sort of, and some of that, debate or that discussion can also be applied to the left, radical left
Oh, yeah.
space, right? Where they have not been immune to sexual harassment or gender-based violence either, and other forms of everyday inequities, right? So, I mean, for a set of people or set of organizations that are so committed to some degree or varying degrees of commitment to emancipatory politics, why do you think that's the case? Is it inherent to the organization? Is it a particular kind of politics? Is it a sort of outcome of the social, or is it something else? Like why do we continue to see this, right? This almost, so the challenging of gender inequities in all its forms sees some resistance within these spaces.
Yes.
So why is it the case, and how do we hold the left accountable the same way as and how do we ensure that as we're moving towards this emancipatory politics, that gender as an issue or caste as an issue doesn't become sidelined, because and some of the reasons with respect to caste you've already mentioned, but perhaps with gender, like how why is it the case, and how do we ensure that it doesn't become sidelined, because this is a moment where the left, whether it's the parliamentary left or the or the far left, is under severe attack, or has been, not just under Hindutva, but has been for some time.
I think it's also, I mean, the emergence of what one might call the autonomous women's movement in India was really in the context of women challenging the left on their relative silence over matters to do with sexuality and violence. When the violence is out there for everybody to see, when the perpetrators are officers of the state or from the capitalist classes or the upper castes and so on, the left with alacrity is able to challenge that and fight it. But when the question is raised as to why will you not discuss issues of sexuality and violence as being of importance within how you think of the social totality, then that has been met with a lot of resistance. With very sort of, all the arguments that you are out to wreck the working class or unity and all of that stuff. But through the 80s, that was a big battle that feminists who had been socialized into being political subjects through the left, far left, and various other left formations, were finally forced to turn to their comrades and say, look, this is not happening, you're not thinking these questions through. And part of that anguish came perhaps from being witness to experiences of harassment and abuse and violence as well. Part of it might have been a conceptual sort of limitation that they were pointing to. That's certainly the case. Now, how do we think of this? This is an interesting question. I think in the 80s and 90s we worked with all the tools that were given to us from Anglo-America and Europe, basically sort of drawing on unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism and a whole bunch of texts that you know as well as I do.
The socialist feminist,
all of that stuff. But I don't know if it really helped us to understand what was happening in our context. And I think perhaps here we need to again think of the formation of the left political subject. I mean, whether it's the party person or the organizer or the theoretician or whoever, and that somewhere the self-definition of being a left political subject absolves you of having to think through certain social and cultural complexities which might have left their mark on you. I think because you've arrived into a certain way of being which is left, you've automatically left those things behind. It's the same thing. Capitalism will swallow pre-capitalist relations. So a socialist human person has already put behind these other things. But we know that's not the case at all, because these act at the level of pure unreason at some level. But also at the level of gesture, body language, speech, certain assumptions about human relationships, certain ways of thinking about the body. All of these are part of the cultures that we grow up in. So you can't transcend those cultures without actually working at such a transcending. And I don't know if that sort of education is what is part of party education at all. It's one thing to give them Kolantai and Clara Zetkin to read, but to actually think through these cultures that are part of our lived context is another matter altogether. Of course, in times of major struggles, these where the social is itself transformed, some of these issues spontaneously or through in the course of the struggle come up, and you're forced to discuss them. You're forced to sort of make certain kinds of changes in the way you think about women comrades. I mean,
and that of course has played a big role in the movements
in the
itself,
movements itself,
right?
yes, and I do think it has made a big difference for the progress of those movements.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can immediately think of Telangana and Tebaga, where women were present in such large numbers and forced certain issues onto the party. I mean, even now, I don't know if you read the Kavita Punjabi's book, right? So, and one of her anecdotes, she says, I mean, P.C. Joshi was frankly, he said, I don't know what to do with so many women.
Right.
I mean, and that's a real admission of not having thought through the presence of women in your party ranks.
Right.
And Sundaraya time and again said that we did not do justice to the women who were part of the party. They all recognized that they were not prepared for it. And not because of bad faith, but because they were simply unprepared.
Right.
And they had not developed ways of thinking about it. More recently, when some of us had gone to Kirvenmani 8 years ago and met an old comrade who was the secretary of the Nagapattinam district committee of the CPM, and he was saying, hundreds of women who were part of our ranks and who would, with no sort of push on their own, would come to protest and would develop these innovative modes of struggle. And for example, they would go and sit in front of the landlord's house and set up this massive keening. It should embarrass them no end, because then that's a sign of inauspiciousness. You don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they would do all these things, but what did the party do in return? We didn't think through those things and think of how we may work with women other than just supplementary warriors, no?
Right.
So I think there's a sense that once you see women in large numbers doing stuff, you have no way of ignoring it. You're forced to do something, forced to carve out roles, places, and so on. But as we know again from Tebaga and Telangana, when that moment is past, those lessons are put away. They disappear from your rehearsed sense of what that struggle was, or your official sense of what that struggle was. So you only want Viranganas and heroines.
Right.
You don't want to think of these issues that were raised and brought up. If you had done that, then you will pass them into what passes off as a left learning tradition or into the official archive of the left or whatever it is. If you don't do that, then how are you ever going to remember that yes, these were issues and we've thought through them, maybe we can think through them again.
And how do you progress
From there,
point,
yeah,
as opposed to reinventing
absolutely.
the wheel?
You
Right?
don't have to, because
Yes.
none of these are exceptional situations.
Right.
One thing we all know, that the ruling classes are extremely repetitive, boring in their forms of
Right.
violence. They have not
Right.
invented anything that
Right.
they haven't already practiced for thousands of years. The weapons may be more destructive, but the forms have remained the same.
Right.
So I mean, in that sense, I think that's a huge limitation. But also, I think in terms of how do you also talk about sexual love within the party? That's also important, not simply in terms of, a discourse of prohibitions. That doesn't help either. And one example, I think, I mean, since we are all reading it again and we don't know the exact details of it, see what the Zapatistas attempted.
Right.
That you fall in love and you want to lead a life outside a fighting army, go do it.
Right.
It's not something that I will scorn. You go, come whenever you're ready. And
Right.
they were sent off to do other work. So that's one approach.
Yes.
That's something that is possible. But then you can't. But most left parties prefer the prohibitory approach,
Sure.
or they move into another mode where they insist there's a liaison that you have to get married or you have to be identified with this individual, which is also extremely restrictive.
Right.
So you may not want to be with that individual after some time. I mean, who knows? So that whole unease about sexuality, the sort of fixation on marriage, on coupledom, on not being able to think of it in other ways, that also is something that has to be consciously challenged and thought through. But even if one were to do all of this, we all know that the act of sexual violence can also be completely in a moment that has nothing to do with how intelligent you are or sensitive you are to these issues. And that's something I myself don't understand. I mean, the randomness of the act sometimes. How does one account for it? How does one make sense of it? But
And how does one then, sort of hold the person
responsible, accountable,
and what does one do in terms of?
We know that left parties have taken strict measures to the extent of even ordering the death of comrades who known to have indulged in acts of sexual violence. I don't know if that's a solution either. Sometimes I think if you've had enough women, feminists, Marxists thinking through these issues within party formations, we may have come up with a more nuanced sense of this thing. I get that feeling when I read Anuradha Gandhi, for example. I mean, I don't think she writes like a conventional Maoist intellectual. I think there's her whole interest in dealing with the women's question, with what feminism has to offer, is a seeking of dialogue.
Right. Is this sort of, like, and we talked about this when we were talking about, you were talking about the second moment
The self-respect
of
movement.
the self-respect movement is what are these alternatives? So you're
Yes,
not receiving wisdom from the text,
Yes,
but
yeah.
you're trying to seek, what makes sense for
Yes.
a particular moment.
Exactly.
And Anuradha Gandhi does
tried that
right?
very
And
well. It's a very
yes.
unfortunate thing that there are not more women like her in leadership positions or in the Politburo or wherever. So I think that is a very important thing also to keep in mind. I think the whole question of gender and sexual violence cannot be contemplated out of a situation where Politburo is largely male, Central Committee is largely male, and then you have these women as sort of supplements to this all male conclave, and I mean that also has to change. I mean,
in talking about the political subject, right? How do you constitute or reconstitute
the
a
political subject,
right?
and it mustn't be some mechanical representation. I'll have 3 women or something,
Right.
no, but there must be a way in which you sort of watch out for what women activists are doing and make decisions on that basis. But without that, I don't know if anything is possible. I mean, general strictures against sexual violence or tribunals will help to an extent, but I think it's really how do you reconstitute the political subject of socialism,
Right.
and that has to be a gendered anti-caste subject in the Indian government, non-gendered in a sense of conscious of gender,
Right.
and committed to the annihilation of caste in some ways. And how do you do that? And they are very closely linked also.
Right.
So that I think is a project that cannot be tagged on to existing projects. Like I said, of the non-Brahmin self-respect movement, that you can remember that legacy, you can draw from it, but you have to radically rethink it also.
Right.
And how do you do that? And rethinking doesn't mean tagging different things together to create a pastiche, no?
Right.
It's not a quilt making exercise we are all involved in.